Welcome to another episode of the Network for Financial Crime Prevention podcast. I'm your host, Louis Vargas, the founder of NFCP, and we're joined today by Eric Sohn, aka Mr. Sanctions, formerly known as Mr. Watchlist. So we'll have a chance to get to know Eric and what keeps him interested in this space in the various roles he's had over the past decade. But first, some quick housekeeping. If you're not a member of NFCP, you can sign up via our website, which is www.nfcp.info. You could also follow us on LinkedIn and subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. Our community exists for you, those that work in the risk, compliance, and fin crime areas in any industry. Keep in mind, for today and most of our podcasts, we are only sharing personal thoughts and in no way what we say today should be taken as legal advice. So without further ado, thank you, Eric. Welcome to the NFC podcast.
Thanks, Louis. Thanks for having me on this cold day up in northern New Jersey. I think southern New Jersey. It feels like northern New Jersey because it's minus 15 Celsius today.
Oh boy. Yeah, I mean, I think we're at 0 in Copenhagen, so you're colder than us. So I could definitely understand. Stay inside. Before we get to the first question, I thought this was funny as I was preparing for the podcast. I wanted to, of course, I already knew you. I knew of you. I followed you for some time, but I was like, okay, let me just try to find some more information about Eric. So I Googled your name and without the middle initial, and the first person that popped up was a K-pop singer.
Stone is not one of the most popular Korean last names, but it is not rare. In South Korea, it's Kim and Han and Park are the top three. But for years, I was getting junk mail in Hangul, in Korean language.
That's so funny. See, I mean, this is also maybe, a good story. We have to be careful with these watch lists because if you do a quick search manually, you might end up with the wrong person.
Well, actually, that's actually a very good point. So one of the challenges in screening in general is how broad your geographic scope is. So we work, when I was with my previous employer, which was Dow Jones, we worked with a screening vendor who had a bunch of linguists. So they had they had a table of synonyms. So, and some of them were semantic and some of them were foreign translations, but they had things like the number 4 being equivalent in Italian to fire. Well, fire is F-I-R-E.
Mm-hmm.
And 1 is premier. Well, not in America. Premier doesn't mean first or
Right.
1. It means best. So one of the challenges with any of your technology solutions is being cognizant of what you can and you can't use, because what may be applicable over in this part of the world may not be applicable, may cause you trouble in another part of the world. We got calls about, why are we matching on this? And it was like,
No, definitely understand that. And being involved in screening as well, we could see sometimes issues when something is just transliterated or it's actually translated appropriately. And you see those differences, as you mentioned, when things might generate or might not. But hopefully technology is getting better, especially with the advent, and it gets a bit more crisp, but it's still left to be seen.
Agreed.
Cool. So let's jump into it. So you've mentioned on your site that Sanctions has always been your first love. And to be honest, it also has been mine. I fell into this, career by accident, but I was just thrown into Sanctions and now I'm just hooked. So what is it about Sanctions specifically that captivates you after all these years in the field?
Well, before I got into Sanctions, I actually had a puppy love, which was funds transfer. I was a wholesale funds transfer person, dealing in SWIFT, dealing in Fedwires and chips in the United States. And what I loved about that was the rules. Was it that you could follow regulations and that would guide the way you ran your business. And there was always a reasoning behind it. And I found that really interesting. But with Sanctions, not only did you have all these wonderful regulations and guidance and frequently asked questions, you also had the added bonus of it being real world, right? So the fact that you have to keep a certain percentage of bank deposits in a banking account, well, that's all well and good, and it has a reasoning behind it, but it's not like you can pick up a paper. Well, remember papers? You could look at CNN.com and see a news story, and you say, "We're going to see something happening in sanctions because of it." So its attachment to real world events is unique because it happens more frequently. So if you look at my current site, it says, moving, I talk about speed. We look at the speed of the world, because as the world turns and things change, sanctions change. There was a Syria sanctions program a while back in the United States. Well, not anymore. And I find that fascinating because sometimes what happens and what doesn't happen, it's a combination of world events and a real politic. Why did, for example, and I know I'm batting on a bit, why did Usmanov, who I think he's the guy who owns Metallo Invest, why did they make an exception in the United States for his holdings? Because they discovered when they sanctioned Deripaska that they screwed up the market for aluminum, because he owned indirectly a United Company Rusal, and they didn't want to do that to Metallo Invest, because Metallo Invest in steel and iron, that would have been bad.
Right.
So be able to point to things and say and understand them in a non-geeky, in a real world way, is what made me love sanctions.
No, thanks for sharing that. And I would have to agree. I love the real time nature of it, right? We're the first line of defense because we screen in real time. But also, as you said, it's attached to geopolitical issues. You could do horizon scanning to kind of come up with assumptions of what might happen or what jurisdictions to watch out for. And it is quite dynamic. And something that I've said for a long time, and I think people now are starting to realize it, is that people used to think sanctions was just list based, and they're like, oh, that's easy. It's a list. No, you don't need to really think about it. And it's like, no, that's just scratching the surface. There's so more to sanctions compliance, and that dynamicism is a big part of it. So moving on to the next question, you've mentioned that finding trends in yearly actions across regulators, although it's still really OFAC and OFSV. But can you, at this point, can you share some examples of regulatory requirements or expectations that you discover through enforcement actions?
Well, sure. I mean, my favorite actually is one from, I don't know what year it was, Unicontrol. So Unicontrol was dealing with a number of European distributors. And over a number of years, there were some signs that distributors were interested in dealing with Iran. And every time they said, no, we're not going to, they didn't actually take any actions that they thought had any actual nexus to Iran, but they didn't keep track of them. And so there were all these little red flags down the road. And it wasn't until one of the European distributors said, our Iranian client would like you to remove the made in the USA stickers because it's causing a problem domestically. At that point, they went to their lawyers, and OFAC basically said, you got to keep track of the red flags. You should have known that this distributor who had asked you years ago, would you mind sending your pressure switches to Iran? You should have been able to say, oh, when this came up, no, I have to, I need to turn this down. I wonder whether or not there will ever be a requirement to report on red flags, even if you're not, freezing any assets. So it would be good for the community to know that this distributor is doing this. Or yes, you can say no, but that only helps you.
Exactly.
That doesn't help the community. So that's a good one. Another good one is Alliance Steel had all U.S. customers, all U.S. suppliers, all U.S. employees, operations in the U.S. only. So they didn't really have a sanctions program. because they didn't need it. They didn't think because everything was domestic. Forget the fact that there are some U.S. parties on the STM list. Let's forget about that. But one day, well, what happened was when they used to have a surge of business, they didn't have spare capacity, so they would go out to third parties to take care of the excess. Well, at one point, they hired the vice president's friend's firm, who was an Iranian firm. And they got, so even though their business was in general very, very low, very, very low risk,
Right.
you know, they got dinged, that was not, I guess, not considered a risk-based decision, despite what the framework document says.
Right.
There have been over time, there was, for example, there was always a first time they said, oh, you have to look at DNS addresses and IP addresses. And so at one point there was a first one, and you didn't think of that. You didn't think of stopping references to email addresses in IR for Iran. Yeah. And those all came out of enforcement actions.
Funny you mentioned that. A couple of things I want to touch on is that I think that there might have been people in the industry that wanted to start screening against it or put in controls against it, but because there was no precedent at the time, I bet a lot of businesses were like, wait, that's not a requirement, we don't have to go that far yet. And they could be compliance officers that said, no, we need to stay out ahead of it. But then they say, no, that's too much, what they call gold plating, a bit too much. Let's just stick within the requirements. And then companies get dinged for it, and now it's a requirement.
I'm glad you mentioned that. Because what happened last week in the UK? OFAC fined the Bank of Scotland for basically not going above and beyond, right? Because their screening engine didn't do a great job of handling name variations. And they specifically said, no, we expect more out of Bank of Scotland. Now, again, that is the size and sophistication is part of the OFAC screening, enforcement guidelines.
Right.
But there isn't that level of clarity from OFAC.
Right.
But clearly, and again, risk. There's the idea of a risk-based program, even in sanctions, strict liability, but risk-based program. That we expect more from a Societe Generale than we expect from Joe's dry cleaning establishment.
No, so true. And just touching on something else you mentioned, that OFAC should probably consider having some sort of repository for red flags. Like in the EU, now there's a requirement to report on circumvention attempts. So I think they're trying to start something. The problem is, as you know, the EU is so fragmented that a lot of the countries and competent authorities weren't set up for that. And they don't know now how to split up the FIU request and now the sanctions circumvention request and how to investigate them. So I think it's not a perfect system, but it's something. And I guess we'll see when AMLA finally comes to full strength, how they deal with it, because I'm sure that'll fall under their remit. But hopefully, to your point, hopefully the US can figure out a similar system and then figure out a way how to disseminate it with, the industry so that we could also be aware.
Well, it does help that we're a single country.
Right. Exactly.
Right. You don't, when the federal government dictates, then that's easy. I always thought it amazing how the EU, with very little dissension, has gone down this road with regard to Russian sanctions. Now, mind you, of course, it's one thing to put things into federal law, into your national law, something, of course, to enforce them.
Right.
And you see that in AML as well. I remember specifically some years ago when Singapore got its assessment from FATF, and they basically said, well, you've got great laws here, you've got great mechanisms. Would it be nice to actually see an enforcement action? Yes, it would be.
That's a great point, because that's, talking to other countries like Ireland or even, some Nordic countries, they don't really have enforcement when it comes to sanctions issues. They could fine you or maybe try to, but then sometimes there's something in the law that prohibits them from actually taking enforcement. So it's like there's a law to say you have to follow EU sanctions and you have the ability to create your own sanctions program, but the enforcement part, for some reason, was missing.
In a lot of countries, what happens is you see fines coming out of regulatory oversight where they look at the controls and they, we're not going to point to a specific deficient case, but your controls are deficient according to our standards.
Right.
And it's not as timely. It's not as timely. It doesn't give us as much of a learning opportunity to other firms. Yeah, of course, it's better than nothing, but that's why OFC and OFAC are very different in that there is this reporting mechanism, there is this discount for voluntary disclosure, and there is more guidance out there. Now, I will admit, I speak only English. I speak some Japanese. So if there is regulation guidance in other countries that is more specific, I'm personally unaware of it. That it may exist. I'll tell you one thing. One thing I happen to love was the Swedish government set of EU sanctions pages are very descriptive. I enjoy sometimes finding just the detail about, if I'm a company in Albania, where does my government tell me what my requirements are? Am I expected to go read all those EU decisions? I should hope not.
So true. Let's dive into, I guess, let's put a spotlight on the OFAC framework, because you already started talking about that before. So, the document gets high praise by you, especially you've already mentioned it, and because it's a great benchmarking tool. And for our NFCP community members who are maybe newer to sanctions, why is this document, in your opinion, so valuable, and how should compliance professionals be using it?
Well, first of all, it's not so different than what you see for anti-money laundering. The five pillars that you see from FinCEN in the United States, for example, that's been around since, well, four of them around since the 70s. And they match up. The risk assessment policies and procedures, independent testing, training. So it's not a huge paradigm shift for compliance professionals. But B, this is the first document that says, yeah, we've always said you need to have a compliance program. Well, what should that look like? Now we're telling you. Right. Now we're saying that you should at least show me that you've read this. It's an advisory document, right? It's a document where you have to have read it. You have to show that you've thought about it. You don't have to adopt everything. And again, it's a risk-based program. Right. So what policy and procedures means for a small firm versus a large firm are very different. But you certainly have to give it some thought and say, where in my organization do I have that? Do I have that compared to what I see in remediations from enforcement actions of firms that have had to create or beef up their sanctions screening program? How do I mark against that? Because those are coming from the framework document. All of this stuff that's published, while it's a there are requirements, hard and soft, there are also great opportunities to say, where are we? Are we going to be the next one because we weren't thinking about this enough? Right. Compliance is known as the Department of Business Prevention, as you know, but it's also the office of preventing you from getting a very large fine. If you look at that Bank of Scotland thing, the value of all the transactions that went into that account that they were talking about was 77,000 odd British pounds. Their penalty was 160, right? That was the base. After all the reductions, I think it was 160 was the penalty. So it dwarfed even the value, not even their revenue. It dwarfed the value. Now, OFC is a little nasty. They like to send out fines that are very large to message to the community that we're serious about this. Just for the heck of it all, by the way, when I published this on my blog, I also asked Gemini, because that's the AI tool I use. Said, look at the facts of this case and tell me, what would OFAC have done? And it came back and said, explain why. And they came back and they said, well, using OFAC's enforcement guidelines, that would have been a 49, would have been, instead of I think it was a $200,000 fine, it would have been a $49,000 fine.
Oh, wow.
Because they were self-reported,
Right.
considered non-egregious, right? Which means that the base penalty is half the transaction value,
Right.
which was, so, but again, anything that's published, I had someone complain to me once in Bangladesh, said, this is so complicated. And I looked at them, I said, yes, and it's still there. I think we should be all grateful for, even if we're not in the US, for having these things out there,
Yeah.
as a way to say, are we going down the right path? Not are we going to get caught, but are we going down the right path so that if our regulator ever does enforce, we have some insulation. Even things like the enforcement guidelines. Yeah, even if your regulator doesn't enforce, those are good things to consider about when something goes south.
Right.
Did our senior vice president our senior chief revenue officer know what was going on? Did we have an email from a whistleblower that we ignored because we valued the revenue more than we valued the compliance? We will not mention some of those firms. So I think that is incredibly valuable, that document. And you'll notice, by the way, in last, I forget how many years is 5, maybe 4 or 5, every single enforcement action, the document includes a reference to that document.
Right.
They wouldn't mention it every single time if it wasn't really important, and they weren't trying to remind you, you need to read this.
Yeah, it's a great point. And that's even me being in the EU right now, that's a document that I always use as a reference when people are talking about an appropriate compliant sanctions program. And even when you're looking at your own sanctions program and you want to say, okay, am I meeting the requirements? I always say, okay, let's take a step back. Let's look at the fundamentals. Let's pull out this document and see how we can document that's aligned with this, or how we could explain it. And if there are gaps, if there's something that you shrug your shoulders about, then that's something to focus on.
Cover your rear with paper, right?
Yeah.
You make decisions about what you will and will not do and why. Who made that decision? What options I love documentation, and not because I like carpal tunnel, but that is one of your first best defenses, which is that we thought about it methodically, we made a decision, we documented that decision. And if they argue with what your decision was, you're going to get off a lot lighter because you actually thought about it, as opposed to you put your finger in the air and said, are we going to get in trouble or not? The other thing about these documents and not only the documents, but the enforcement actions, is they give you a hint of where enforcement and regulation are going, right? Admittedly, there's usually a multi-year gap between the violation and the enforcement, but even so, you can see, when you saw the things regarding DNS addresses and IP addresses, I will admit I didn't think about it, but certainly the issue regarding email address domains. Yeah, a big firm probably should have thought about that if they were collecting that sort of information. What else might be next now that you have unit control? Might in fact you have to show, if you're a larger firm, that you have tracked that. There hasn't been a second one like that, but you, just like you do horizon scanning for other things like sovereign risk. Is my business in this country going to go south because the government's unstable, like the United States, for example? You war game. Well, why shouldn't you war game regarding regulation and enforcement? You don't have to spend your entire life doing that. but you should spend some time doing that if your firm expects to grow and expand. Is there going to be do you want to go into a new geography? Do you want to offer a different line of business? Do you want to acquire something that brings you into an adjacent industry where the expectations and the history is different? It would behoove you to do that.
Definitely. Great points there. And I guess I want to touch on another topic that, because you've made a statement in the past that 99% of things we have to review, all that complexity is totally irrelevant. So I'm just wondering if you could unpack that for our community, because I understand, but I also want to hear your point because I think it'll be great for people to hear it.
Sure. You take in, say, you do 100,000 transactions a day. A tiny percentage of those, let's say 1,000, stop in your system for review. We will be aggressive in that regard. Of those, at most 5 go to compliance in a day. So 995 items are sitting in triage. Well, what is generally is the triage? Triage is data is the comparison. Are the names the same? Are the countries the same? Can I eliminate this in a pretty simple way? So it's only a handful of cases that where we haven't empowered our staff to do the additional research required to eliminate these matches. And not to mention, I mean, how often do you really hit a general ledger? Again, depends on the nature of your business, right? I'm talking from financial services. We're not hitting general licenses very often. Now, I actually work for a firm that has a fair amount of blocked securities because we do processing for a number of firms that has had involvement with securities from Sparebank and Rostelcom and Rostec, and earlier some of the Cuban stuff too. But even those, even our staff, they say, okay, it's hitting this name, it goes to compliance, right? So most of the actual processing on a day-to-day basis is the triage area, which might be a compliance team or it might be a business line unit team, because are you really going to make the compliance triage team look at letter of credit detail versus payment detail? And so most of it is, I don't know if you heard the dog. That's a friend of ours. We rarely get into the details we care about, again, unless you're in an industry where you have that entanglement. There is, especially you get down to, say, the sectoral sanctions, right? Where it's only certain transactions, with certain people that's date bound, right? So, for example, you can deal in Russian securities issued in 2012.
Right.
Because it's only new, at least in the U.S. requirement, is because it's new issues of debt and security, debt and equity. So how often do you hit that? You do, or not frequently. So that's why and so therefore a lot of these FAQs you see, they're great, they're really interesting, but do you hit them on a day-to-day basis? Unless you, again, in compliance. Day-to-day, maybe not. Not some time to time, certainly. But the triage unit, that's not their job, and that's most of your spend. Most of your spend is in triage.
Exactly, and those teams, are always inundated, and that's always the ask. That how do we figure out ways to reduce some of that noise? So hopefully, AI is the answer, but it's not the silver bullet that a lot of people think it is. So, you've also mentioned that it's not all rainbows and unicorns, and that AI is just software with rules and data. But given your background, authoring a weekly sanctions newsletter and being a pre-sales SME, what are the most critical limitations that compliance professionals need to understand before deploying AI tools?
Well, AI is all about guardrails. Is
Mhm.
like, what are you allowing it to do? What are you not allowing it to do? I'll give you a really good example. So one of the things I've done on my site is I have AI prompts that reformat OFAC listings so they're more we used to call them as a tech geek, pretty print. So like each field would be on a separate line, so you
Right.
don't have to read a paragraph. You see it in a more tabular format. Well, once I told it to take this series of OFAC designations and reformat it for me, and it was a series of shipping firms and cargo vessels, and all the cargo vessels in the actual listings had a section that said link to name of management firm. Well, when Gemini ran its reformatting job, it added on the management firm's link to name of cargo vessel. And I said, and one of the great things you can do with AI is you can say, why don't you do that?
Right.
So I said, why'd you do that? She said, well, I saw the association, so I created the linkage. Right.
Right.
So the guard, and the thing, the way, I think one thing you have to do is you have to say, okay, that went wrong. How do I fix it?
Right.
So in that case, we just said, do not infer. Only take the data that's actually there
Right.
and reformat that. And you find in a similar fashion, I did things with enforcement actions where I was trying to be very precise and with a scoring model that was not precise, but I was trying to compare
Mhm.
enforcement actions. And then I found that you can hold too tight reins on it or too loose reins on it. And I found that had to be somewhere in the middle.
Yeah.
But with sanctions and AI, you have to um, you kind of have to look at the output, and you have to compare it to what you would have done. And you would say, what's the gap there? Was it smarter than me? Did it make the reasonable assumptions, or did it miss something? I think that if you're going to use AI as a starter kit, the first thing would be to send items that you think are, when you screen items and an AI thinks that it's a false positive, you don't mark it as false positive. You send it straight to the checker. So you skip at least a step. And then you can see that's a quick way to see whether or not you're going down the right path or not. Now, of course, that takes care of that handles your false positives, but you also have to go, and similarly, there are going to be things that fall below its line they might be false negatives. And that's true for a
Right.
standard tool as well. And you have to do below the line checking. I'll go use a non-AI term. If your matching threshold is 85%,
Mhm.
you should probably, from time to time, look between 85 and say 80 or 75 and say, is anything here an actual suspect, something that I probably wanted to see?
Right.
Even if I was going to ultimately let it go, should I have seen it? And it's always hard because those numbers, 85, 75, they vary tool to tool, but they also vary based on the nature of your business.
Mhm.
So when I was with Acuity some years back, I had a client in Hong Kong, and it was actually a branch of AIG. And when we screened their data at exact matching only,
Mhm.
and then we screened it at, I think, 85%, and the matches doubled. And we screened it at 80%, the matches went up a factor of 12. Because matching data from any model you have is hockey stick data. It's kind of flat at high percentages because your fuzziness doesn't really affect much. And then there's an inflection point and it rises. But these exact same numbers, the 85 and the 80 at Rabo Finance, which again handles just agricultural finance in the
Mhm.
Midwest of the United States. At 85%, it only went up 25%. And at 80, it doubled. So the impact of that change was due purely to the difference in the nature of the parties you were dealing with. You were dealing with banks and farms and people in the financial sector versus a whole bunch of individuals over in Hong Kong.
Right.
And that does tell you again what you can and cannot do. We went back to the example of Theatre and Premiere. Well, if your business is global and you can get stuff in all sorts of languages, Latin characters, you have to say to yourself, well, is my tool being too sophisticated? Could it be too sophisticated?
Right.
Could it be recognizing things that it shouldn't be recognizing because it doesn't know certain things? And again,
Right.
I think you come from a transaction screening
Mhm.
background. That's also very different than static data screening. Customers and employees, and
Yeah.
where you've got that information to leverage. I think a lot of these AI tools, and again, I'm not intimately involved with them because
Mhm.
the vendors I work for hadn't done that yet. They can make reasonable assumptions based on the data they have, but when you're dealing transactions, unless it's an on us party where it is the debit party of an outbound because it came from our database,
Mhm.
you're operating with one hand tied behind your back. So you can do some natural language processing, which will allow you to figure out where a name starts and ends in your OBI or your BBI,
Yeah.
originator beneficiary information or bank to bank information, because not everyone does Swift. Field 70 and 72. So you're operating with limited information, but you can still get some sense of whether something's a match or not. The other thing, of course, is what are your standards for a match or a mismatch? I will tell you at my current employer, they want 2 data points that
Mhm.
are different,
Right.
right? And also with some sense that if the 2 parties are in adjacent countries, adjacent on land, then that is also not a mismatch.
Right.
So imagine Mexico and the southeastern United States,
Right.
southwestern United States. But again, does your AI model, if you're going to give it free rein, is it in line with your risk, with your assumption of risk?
Right.
And what's your ability to tune that, right? And to be perfectly frank, what's your ability to also understand what it's doing? Because if
Mhm.
you can't explain, I let this one go because, you should not be buying that tool. Any tool that does not have an audit trail that explains itself is worthless because it won't stand up to audit scrutiny or to
Yeah.
regulator scrutiny.
Exactly.
So that's the first question: is explainability. Show me what your tool does for a false positive. Show me what it does for a true match. Show me what it generates for me. Because we
Right.
like not being personally liable for our decisions.
Exactly. Yeah, super interesting. And a couple of things I would like to unpack there is that, a lot of companies these days, AI is a buzzword, and, they don't really, there's not really clear how they use AI, but also then they make claims that it can reduce, your false positive by X amount. But to the point you raised, it's all relative, right? It depends on what you're working on, what jurisdictions you're in. So it's not a clear cut, X amount of savings. And I think a lot of people don't realize that, at the face value.
Well, let me put you this way. Do you think that if this vendor promises me a 50% reduction in false positives and I just got hit with a cease and desist order, whether or not I would want that?
Right. That's true.
It's it's all well and good until someone loses an eye. My mom used to say. It's But I think it's also true of almost anything that's more sophisticated than MS Word, that if you don't understand what you're purchasing and it doesn't actually help you with standing up to outside oversight, then you're asking for trouble.
Right.
All right. And so it means I'll be perfectly frank. Vendors need better documentation. You need to be able to see the manuals that are both for you and for the experts. You need to be able to come away and say, I also need this, as well as the day-to-day audit trail type of documentation. Paper will make everyone happier. It'll tell you also whether or not you've set things properly. Having an outside firm come in and configure your matching tool by themselves or with you after a facilitated workshop, right? Facilitated is great. I have no problem with it. But again, you still probably want to run things in parallel to start. And you probably want to take baby steps. You really do, only because it's new, and to assume that level of trust is probably misplaced. So again, skip the maker step and just push everything out to checkers, right? Assuming, of course, you are doing the right thing and making sure that everything that's marked false positive gets a second pair of eyes. Because why would you trust your makers? I don't know if anyone actually does that, but certainly that saves you a certain amount of work, especially again, if your tool attaches the documentation. What sources did I use? Why did I say this name was different than that name? Is great for assembling data, doing research for you, does that, but doesn't tell you what it did. It's pretty useless.
I agree. And, to kind of piggyback on that's the part that I think, especially in sanctions, that we get worried about, is that the AI is making a decision on our behalf. Obviously, we need a human in the loop. And that's also something in the EU AI Act. I don't think the US adopted anything yet, but there might be something out of California. But, it's not that we could just throw everything at AI and expect it to come out perfect, right? We have to have the right oversight, the right documentation. And like you said, I agree wholeheartedly that it's good at bringing data together, maybe highlighting key points, but especially in sanctions compliance, there's so much gray area that you can't train the model in a way to think as a human. I mean, there might be instances where if we're making the same decision, a lot of times it could pick up on that, right? Decision reapplication. But other than that, it's very difficult.
I was going to say that because, what is whitelisting, for example? Whitelisting is a level of risk that you have accepted that, for example, Astoria Energy 2 is not the company that I know that I've done due diligence on, is not the Astoria cargo vessel that was recently added to the UK HM Treasury list. I forget what actually they call it, but that's the name that Lexus calls that list. You can in fact make those things, and certainly you could have a system by where your AI would look at the patterns in the things that is sent to you and you've approved, and propose a whitelist and then implement that whitelist. Certainly, and that would be a good thing, because why should it send you Astoria Energy 5 times 50 times every single day? So leveraging that kind of stuff is useful. But the funny thing is that a lot of these tools, even in traditional systems, depending on the nature of your traffic, also does a pretty good job. We've reduced our match rate by 98%, over the span of a year, by writing, I think, 70 whitelist entries. And I will tell you that while it's adequate, it's not, the one we have is not the be all and end all of false positive reduction. I've seen some tools. I've seen one from EastNet SafeWatch. It allows you to write like algebra. So you can say, ignore this match in field 79 of a 199 from the sender. So you can get really
very specific,
right? Ours doesn't do that, but still 98% reduction, where literally, I think it was Tuesday, we actually had nothing stopped for review.
Wow.
We had over like 300 items got passed by our whitelist and nothing stopped for review.
Right.
Which is which allows us to do the other work. You know, although I'd really, really appreciate the ability to pick up a paycheck for doing absolutely nothing. But that's using traditional tools and comparatively dumb tools, you know. Now, admittedly, sanctions is easier in that regard. There are fewer targets. There are some clumps that are difficult, such as the Hispanic names for drug trafficking in the US and the Islamic names, right? But compared to, say, doing PEP screening, a PEP, you know, if you think of the PEP database, and especially if you include all the local regulatory differences, you're talking basically a good proxy for the global namespace. You're going to get a much, much higher, you know, match rate on that or negative news screening than you'll ever get on sanctions. So we're lucky in that regard. So traditional tools like even whitelisting will have a big impact. You know, the other thing I think that people need to think about is, why am I looking at AI? Is it purely cost reduction? If that's your driver, you should think twice. Only because that never holds up to regulatory scrutiny, unless you really dot your I's and cross your T's. You know, if you think that it is hard to get staff, so any little bit of help we can have in terms of identifying, doing the research, and documenting what we, you know, our reasons for doing it, that's much more defensible. So you consider the real need, I'd say, you know, and don't necessarily shut down AI just because it can make mistakes. It's a lot of work. But depending on the nature of what you have, yeah, it could be a step change in the quality of what you produce.
Yeah, that point you made about the regulators not wanting to hear that excuse, I heard that firsthand from one of the regulators in Europe. I won't say which country, but yes, be careful. If you do make that statement, they're going to dig deep. So you're not going to get the relief you think you are by making such a statement.
And yeah, and I'll tell you a funny story. I was over in a bank in a certain country, which we will not name, and I was speaking to we were pitching at the time the 50% rule data that we produced at Dow Jones, and we told them that we had at the time 20,000 listings on the list. This was clearly before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and the deputy compliance officer blanched. It was like, oh my God, that's 4 times the size of the SDN list at the time. And he said, we'd rather get fined.
Oh, wow.
By the way, a few years later, for their AML unit, they did get fined.
Well, he got what he asked for, man. All right. So, I mean, this has been a great conversation. We have one question left before I let you off the hot seat. So, what advice would you give to someone just starting their career in sanctions today, especially given how different the landscape is with the advent of new technologies like AI compared to when both of us started, I would say?
I would say that you should read some of the basic documents. You certainly should read enforcement actions. And I would use AI to do some research for you. So, for example, you know, finding trends in enforcement actions, it's much easier to tell it to go through the last 10 years and find patterns. Think more clearly, probably more sophisticated than you can if you're just starting out. So it can find things that you won't think about. And as long as you tell it, show your work, show the sources, you know, do not infer, you know, or if you infer, tell me you're inferring and why you're inferring it, because it'll do that too. But as long as you're clear with it and you put guardrails around what you're telling it to do, it's a great way to get up to speed and get more sophisticated quicker, rather than reading a lot of documents that perhaps at your level of sophistication you don't need yet. Do you really need to read every FAQ? No. But if you got an item on your screen, you're a new compliance officer, and you could say, here's the transaction I'm looking at. Go through the frequently asked questions and find anything that is relevant to that type of transaction and put it up on my screen. Boy, is that a time saver.
Oh yeah, big time. Awesome. Great advice, Eric. And thank you once again for joining us today. For those of you who want to connect with Eric, you can find him on LinkedIn. and also visit MrSanctions.com. I subscribe to his blog. It's definitely a great resource. And like I said, I've been following Eric for many years. You can also find us, again, as mentioned before, at nfcp.info. Connect with me or the network directly on LinkedIn. Email us at info@nfcp.info. We have virtual and in-person events coming for leadership from practitioners across the globe, and a growing network of people who understand that that financial crime prevention is a shared responsibility, and it's better when we do it together. So until next time, stay vigilant, stay informed, be brave, and keep pushing the boundaries of what's possible in compliance and financial crime prevention. This has been
Thanks,
the
everyone.
Network for Financial Crime Prevention podcast. Thanks again, Eric.
Thank you.